Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the KT Canada Seminar Series. Today we're really happy to have with us Harlan Pruden from the BC Centre for Disease Control and Two-Spirit Dry Lab to talk about a COVID-19 language guide, which provides guidance for inclusive language for written and digital content. So just a couple of procedure items before we jump into the bio. So there will be time for Q&A once the presentation has ended, and that will be after approximately 45 minutes. If you do have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat and send it to everyone, or you can also use your raise hand function if you'd like to ask out loud. Perfect. So I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. So Harlan Pruden is from the Nehiyaw First Nations Cree Nation and works with and for the Two-Spirit community locally, nationally, and internationally. Currently, Harlan is an Indigenous Knowledge Translation Lead at Chi Mammoth, an Indigenous Public Health Program at BC Centre for Disease Control, and is also a co-founder of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, which is North America's first research group that exclusively focuses on Two-Spirit people, communities, and experiences. Harlan is also the managing editor of twospiritjournal.com and an advisory member for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute of Gender and Health. Before relocating to Vancouver in 2015, Harlan was co-founder and director of NYC community-based organization, the Northeast Two-Spirit Society, and was a President Obama appointee to the US Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS through PACHA, and provided advice, information, and recommendations to the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the White House. I have a line here that says, in December 2018, Harlan was happily fired, happily fired or dismissed from PACHA by Mr. Trump via FedEx. So it's really fantastic to have you with us today. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here today. Sensei, Nititimtik Harlan Pruden, Ewaka Nomani Niha 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 Ayagwe. Greetings, my relatives. My government name is Harlan Pruden, and I use the I word. You can ask me why I use the I word, but my Indian name is actually in Sioux. I was doing some work on the Rosebud Reservation, and they honored me with the name Waka Nomani. Waka being spirit, a good spirit, bad spirit, neutral spirit. You know, I can do good just as well as I can do bad, or I can like suck. So that part of my name is how do I want to show up? And so I try to show up with good words, good actions, good thoughts, okay, because I have to work on my thoughts. And Nom is two, and Mani is a sacred journey. And so I was going to get that translated into Cree, or in our language, we would say Nehiyaw. Great pronunciation, Tina. My mother is from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve. My father is from the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve. Two different reservations, but the same Treaty 6 territory. And I also said that I am Two-Spirit, and I know that I do a lot of work with and for the Two-Spirit community. And but today, what we're going to be talking about is language and the importance of language. How does that look? Perfect. So today, and I want to do a little, okay, not cheap, but a big plug for November. We have a date already set up for November, which we'll be talking about some of the work of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab and some decolonizing practices, as well as methods, as well as just ways of doing research with and for Indigenous folks. And more culturally safe and culturally competent ways. Once again, my name is Harlan Pruden. Wait. Get your QR code reader. So it has like some resources on your phone. We'll also be sending out this PowerPoint later. Since about 2017, my I've been working at the BC Centre for Disease Control for an Indigenous public health program. And then early on in April of the pandemic, I was seconded to do to various communication working groups within BCCDC on basically developing our public facing guidance, as well as when the orders were coming down from our provincial health officer, is we had to like provide that translational space so that we can get the guidance out. Okay, a little thing about, I was like talking to my team members. Okay, this is a picture of me when my partner and I were in Turkey. And if you see on the top right-hand corner, that's my partner there taking a picture of me. And you can see, so I love this headshot because my partner's there also. And it was like with him with his cell phone, which I think is kind of cute that my partner is always there. I've been with my partner for about, this year will be 15 years that we've been together. All right. Before I go any further, I wish to acknowledge that I'm on the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Now, these land acknowledgements, I know that they, folks are, I hear them a lot, right? And they almost become like a perfunctory statement, right? Like we do the land acknowledgement and then we turn to the real business, and Indigenous people, communities, and who we are don't show up in the rest of the talk. And so that's not really going to happen within this conversation. And so I always like, as a good practice, is what does it mean, and what does it mean when you say that, and where do we take it from, right? So when I acknowledge the fact that I'm on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and First Nations people, which you all may know that as Vancouver, there's a couple of things I just want to unpack, right? One is, if I didn't do this land acknowledgement, I kind of liken me to walking into your office or walking into your home and not acknowledging that I'm in your home or your office. And if we carry that analogy forward, I would start telling you how and when to live and to dwell and to be in your own home or in your own office. And so that's not what I want to do. This is not my territory. I've approached all 3 protocol offices for the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish folks, and asked if I can be a guest in and on their territory. So it's just a protocol, and thanking them for tolerating my presence. The other thing that I want to unpack is, for this territorial acknowledgement, is to remind as well as position myself as a guest and a visitor on their territory and on their land and home. And it's also to remind me that I'm an ambassador for my people. Because if I don't carry myself in a good and an honorable way, I run the risk of my hosts thinking nasty things about Harlan, but then they may also think nasty things about my Cree people. And so I carry myself as an ambassador for my Cree people. And so it's both me and my people. And we all have people, and those people show up in the room before you show up in the room. And so it's like, who do we represent and who are we? You don't just show up in the room by yourself, you show up with your people. And so I think for the land acknowledgement is to position myself as a guest, to remind myself that I'm an ambassador and that I must carry myself with a good way so that I'm representing my people in a good way. So and I think it's a really good practice of, like, when you say that and do a territorial acknowledgement, take a little time and unpack it. What does that actually mean? And what does it mean to you? And there begins the kind of conversation, rather than just saying, traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of X nation. And then you get to the real business, right? Unpack that land acknowledgement. And I would encourage you all. So I just want to model that at the beginning. And yes, it does take time, but I think that we must take the time to do that. And that's a part of the beginning part of reconciliation. And you will see that other conversations will emanate from that land acknowledgement. All right, turning to the language guide. So as I said before, a while ago, back in February 2020, I was seconded to the BC Centre for Disease Control COVID-19 Communications Working Group for the development of public-facing documents. Very early in March 2020, I'm a part of another national US advisory board looking at clinical trials around HIV prevention interventions within the United States. And one of the members, Rona, that I sit on this board with, is from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, or NIAID, Anthony Fauci's organization that he heads. They released their language guide, and it was the NIAID language guide, but it was around HIV and AIDS. And I kind of printed it, and it was like sitting on the side of my desk. And as I was developing and weighing in on the various public-facing guidance, I kept on flipping through this HIV guide and using it. And I was like, you know, instead of saying HIV, I was like putting it into COVID-19. And it became very valuable to myself in my reviewing process. But starting in late March 2020, Emily Rempel, Katie Fenn, and myself were the co-principal investigators for Michael Smith Foundation Health Research Grant, where we were trying to look at it was a really quick rapid survey to assess knowledge, attitudes, behaviors around misinformation, personal protection, and public health measures for COVID-19 in BC. And also part of this story is on our public-facing guidance, we had the yucky V word, vulnerable and vulnerable populations. And and I wanted to get it out. We were also using words such as risk from the HIV community, like an HIV risk or risky sex, you know, can connote potentially stigmatizing frameworks when talking about diseases. So if we look at the Michael Smith survey, and I think this was really pivotal in starting to lean into the knowledge translation process. So what the overall survey was to proactively address infodemics within BC related to COVID-19. We employed a market research team. Literally, it took us about 10 days to get our survey instrument, and then we like scrubbed through it, and then we turned it over to the market research because we wanted it superly rapid. The overall sample size for Misinformation Survey 1 was around just over 3,000 individuals. We had a nice survey sample of Chinese respondents at around 400, 150 for Indigenous, 138 for South Asian, and 137 for Southeast Asians. And we also purposely included questions to address Two-Spirit as well as LGBTQA communities and peoples in a culturally safe and sensitive ways. We weighted the match Census 2016 data for BC's for taking sex and age into consideration. And if you'll notice the date, 5 days, the survey was open from April 14th through the 19th, and it was only like super early into the pandemic, if you think back to April 2020. I know it feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? Questions included demographics, you know, COVID-19 knowledge, where were folks getting the information, both passively and actively at that time. And we also were looking at communication preferences. Where were folks getting their information? What was that information? And then we were also looking at healthy and harming coping behaviors. Like, what was their alcohol consumption? Were they going out for walks? And then we also asked a series of stigma and discrimination questions. So I'm not going to go through a lot within this survey. But back in April 2020, we saw that Dr. Henry, 54%, about 1 in 2 of British Columbians were looking to Dr. Henry for information, actively looking, which is great. But another way of reading this is like 46% of folks, almost 1 in 2, were not looking to Dr. Henry. So there was like an opportunity to expand Dr. Henry's reach, or perhaps open up other channels for folks to get information. You can see Justin Trudeau back in the day was about 45% were folks looking to that office in those afternoon briefings. And then most research stops here. You know, it's the overall average, right? Of 54% for Dr. Henry, 54 Henry, and 45 for Justin Trudeau. But what we did was we did a race-based analysis of that same data. And if you see, we get a different picture. And what we found was of the folks, the 1 in 2 British Columbians looking to Dr. Henry for information, about 60% were white, 46% Chinese, 45% South Asian, and about 47% Southeast Asian, and a paltry 40% were Indigenous. And if we juxtapose that and compare to that 45% of who were looking to Trudeau and the feds, we see that only 45% of the population, of BC populations that were looking to Trudeau were white, 39% Chinese, about 60%, a big jump for the South Asian, and another big jump for the South Asian, and the 38% that were looking to Henry, about 1 in 2 of Indigenous people were looking to Trudeau. And so we get a slightly different picture than that 54%, and that of like who is looking to who, and that it's ranging. And there's under this analysis, Henry is doing good at 40%, 38% for Indigenous people, but Trudeau, 1 in 2, right? And so how do we look at that? Then the other little piece of information is that I want to draw to your attention as observed stigma and stigma behaviors. And so I'm only going to talk about 2 pieces of data on this slide, but this slide was very illuminating. In that we asked this question, I would find it difficult to tell my friends or my family members if I had COVID-19. So in this is that engaging of that internal stigma, right? And what we found is only 13% of the white public said, I would have a problem telling my friends or family, right? About 30% for Chinese and South Asian, a whopping 42% for Southeast Asian, and about 15% for Indigenous people. And then over here was I am more aware of my ethnic background due to COVID-19. Now remember, this is early on in the pandemic. About 6% of white people said, or white publics said, I'm more aware, right? But it jumps to almost 40% for Chinese and South Asian publics of saying I'm very aware of my ethnicity or my ethnic background due to COVID. 18%, again, 15% for Indigenous population. And so from this slide, what we took was that the COVID was landing by degree as well as by impact differently across different publics. And I think John Huygen, there was an awards ceremony here that was held on Tuesday night, I think. And he used that analogy of we're in a storm and you're in a boat, but we're in different boats and the storm is affecting different boats, right? He said it more eloquently. That's his analogy. All I'm saying is, wow, the disease, COVID is landing and impacting different communities differently. And that is the major takeaway. So that all kind of went into a hopper, and the rationale is how can we draw attention to language so that we're not potentially stigmatizing and distancing the very publics in which that we would like to talk to. And, and also in the data, it showed if we did an age-based analysis of that 54% that were looking to Henry, they were older, they were whiter, they were cisgendered. And so we were we need to do something to that attentiveness to language. And so the language guide starts off with this beautiful quote from Julia Penelope, that language is power in many ways, literally, than most people think. When we speak, we exercise the power of language to transform reality. Why don't more of us realize the connection between language and power? So begins our conversation. So the purpose and the frameworks of this language guide is to assist with COVID-19 message and content development by using positive, acknowledging, and inclusive rather than potentially stigmatizing language that may provoke fear and distance the very people that we want to talk to, especially within our guidance. These guidelines incorporate an equity lens, and we use the BC Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which is our affirmation of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. There's also a commitment to cultural safety and humility and health services. And also the guide, we use our core values as the Provincial Health Services Authority. There are some limitations to this guide. One, we recognize that terminology and language is continually changing and evolving. This is a moving target, right? What holds true today may not hold true to tomorrow. So these guidelines highlight current practices and principles as of June 2020 and thereby are not all encompassing. There's also a commitment for a biannual, a January and July review. And right now we are in the process of going through a revision of this document, and we have a working group working on that. This guide is only offered in English. It's not offered in other languages. And so it only holds true for English language. And then finally, the guide doesn't address or include specific sections on graphics and or images. And so again, the guide is incomplete. We will be talking about images and graphics and some of the projects that have grown out of the guide in a little bit. There are some guiding principles like language matters, practicing the platinum rule. We all know what the golden rule is, right? Treat others the way that you want to be treated. Well, no. The platinum rule is treat others the way that they wish to be treated. And so we do those things like, what's your pronoun, rather than me assigning you a pronoun, right? Is looking to folks how they want to be treated. And so within the language guides, those are such pretty flowers. When I was doing like a kind of an environmental scan of language guides and guidance documents came in two big buckets. There was like these guiding principles, not much detail, and then there was like highly prescriptive guidance. And so what I did is a hybridization of starting off with some guiding principles, and then I actually gave some examples so that folks could like taste it and experience it, but they actually had a little bit of a roadmap. So how do we use those guidelines? So first of all, is they continue the consideration of the intended audience when developing content and applying these examples used in the guide. So it's really important. Who do we want to talk to? Define that. And then you meet that community once you have you've answered that question. So like if I wanted to talk to older white people, I'd be running and knocking on Dr. Henry's door, right? But if I want to talk to like the Gen Xers and that are non-white Gen Xers, we have to utilize maybe different mediums. Maybe we have to start tailoring the different messaging to reach to those communities. Content developers should also have an operational understanding of the guiding principles articulated in this book. Or any other book. Like this is not the end all or be all, right? And then the suggested alternatives for these commonly used words, terms, and phrases. The guide doesn't capture all potentially stigmatizing language. It's a moving target. So content developments should work to ensure their language meets or exceeds the spirit of the listed guiding principles. And so that's the work of like, is this the right word? Is there a better word? Let's put it through the guiding principles. Does it satisfy a majority of these principles, right? Even though it's not listed within the book. The breakdown of the guide is like disease basics. There's also racial, ethnic, and cultural identities, substance use, sex, gender, sexual identities, pronouns, genders, inclusive language, and it just goes on. And then there was for our categorization, we just like had to dump all like additional terms, topic, and framings, right? Because there's just so much information. So what does the guide look like? So after we've gone through the guiding principles, then we actually want you to test out so they can kind of experience what we're talking about, right? So ripping a page from the HIV activists and the HIV community, and the whole use around infection, infect, became infected, you know, COVID infection or COVID positive, you know, and the HIV community, you know, like COVID is a placeholder. It could be for HIV. It could also be for TB. But the HIV community has like said, like infection carries the stigma of being contagious, a threat, unclean. So the recommendation was offered by HIV activists who were frequently highlighting the damages and consequences of this word choices, of this word framing. So what the guidance of like, try this, try value neutral descriptive language, such as COVID virus transmissions, and try to get out the word of infect and or infection, right? Also the use of risk or, you know, rather than risk factors, chronic conditions. Risk connoting, you know, like there's something dangerous in that. And then also, rather than using the word risk, describe it as like either increasing or decreasing the likelihood or chances of someone getting COVID. So if you're not practicing hand hygiene and physical practices, that is, you can say risk, or what you can say is that there's an increased likelihood or chance of someone getting COVID if you're not doing X, Y, and Z. And so we're just slightly changing it. So the guide is like chock full of these like, try this instead of this. And then there is where we offer some sort of rationale or like the because statement of like, why is this word or this framework potentially stigmatizing, or what we've heard from community. The additional topics, we're building this out, like things like felon, convict, offender, person who has been arrested or convicted of a criminal offense, person who is incarcerated, or person who is formerly incarcerated, person in prison. Rather than giving them the name of an inmate or convict or a felon, that can be like rather reductive and very limited and potentially stigmatizing. So try value neutral descriptive language. All right, there's the V word. Drives me nutty because it's pervasive within public health. And why it's like so like nut bar. Drives me nutty, okay? May not drive you nutty, but it drives me nutty, right? So who's someone who is indigenous, Cree, and also someone who is gay, which we would call that two-spirit in my framework. I, as well as members of my community, are often named as being a vulnerable population, right? Indigenous people, vulnerable populations, right? Well, if it is indeed the case that it is my ingenuity and or my sexual orientation that deems me vulnerable, right? One is, I would never look at myself as being vulnerable. I have power and agency. So just like that on a base level, it's like, come on, noodles. Secondly, is if it is indeed my ingenuity and or my sexual orientation that makes me vulnerable, what or how can I change that? How do I stop being indigenous? How do I stop loving my partner and my same-sex partner? And so what does that say? And I don't know what we're like, yeah, you name us as vulnerable, but if that is indeed, like, how do I change being indigenous? I can't, right? Where it is the systems of homophobia, transphobia, settler colonialism, colonization, those systems, systemic racism, those systems put me at a greater chance or likelihood of having negative health outcomes and quality of life. But in naming that, the problem is posited on the system, systems of settler colonialism, institutional racism, systemic racism. Those systems can change. I cannot change being Indigenous. So, and in that positionality of a vulnerable population, it is me that's the problem, not the system. And so I think we want to draw that into intention. And so Katz wrote this beautiful paper, and there's a link at the top, of like, no group or people is inherently vulnerable. If a group of people is experiencing vulnerability in a particular situation, setting, or system, or society, that vulnerability is being produced by other people. It is entirely possible to trace how that vulnerability is produced and who is responsible. If vulnerable or vulnerability is used, it warrants a description of how it is being produced and who is responsible. So here, it made my heart so happy because I was watching a press conference the other day, and everyone was like talking about extremely clinically vulnerable populations. And I was just like, what? Right? Because clinically vulnerable means that people who are like having like heart disease and or like some other underlying comorbidity, that there is an increased chance or likelihood of that person being more negatively impacted by COVID-19, clinically vulnerable, rather than just saying vulnerable people, right? And so I think what we have to do is try to draw that out. And I think that there's such incredible lessons within that. One, as I started off with, is I would never see myself as vulnerable. So what gives the right for someone to name me as vulnerable? There is such power and privilege within that. And I take that back of like saying, no, 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 Noodle. One, I'm not vulnerable. And two, you have no right to name us. That right belongs to me. And I choose not to be viewed or looked at as being vulnerable. Let's call the systems into focus. So where do I find the guide? If you go to our main landing page and about COVID-19, also within priority populations, that's where it used to be that V word, priority populations. And then also in resource at a glance, and you can like get a link, or if you heeded my advice, you would have your QC coder. You can take a little scan right now, or just go to that very long URL document, a link at the beginning, or sorry, top of the slide. Going back to a QI commitment, as mentioned, this guide will undergo a review in January and July. We're in the process of doing that right now. As language is fluent, dynamic, and ever evolving, and as a result, there's always going to be ways that this guide can be improved and made better. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, and there is my email address. Within our last couple of minutes together, I would just like to first of all, a big thank you to all the folks that gave their time, spirit, and energy to support me this possible. To the Michael Smith Foundation for allowing us to do that research. And we just finished doing a second poll. And so now we're doing our analysis of the second poll of that misinformation survey. The second survey was more around vaccine and where were people getting information around vaccine, and a gauge of whether or not that there was any misinformation that folks were hearing within their community. PHSA and BCCDC, and then all of the staff and the community members that weighed in, reviewed, and helped with the development of this guide, this document. All right, now I said the guide doesn't have any visuals. Well, we built upon that, and even though the guide doesn't talk about visuals, we pivoted to visuals. So what I would like to do is to talk about a little bit of the application and where we went with the language guide. So obviously for the development of all of the public-facing guidance, there was this greater attentiveness to language, as well as like some of the graphics that we were using, and that so that our graphics as well as the language was not stigmatizing, and that centered and called people, the very folks that we wanted to communicate. And so a part of that language, the guidance and the communications working group grew another subcommittee, and it was the COVID-19 Indigenous Knowledge Translation Resource Working Group. So in January of this year, we have a team member for Chimamuk. Her name is Andrea Boyce. Andrea Boyce's community, Chaeskin, or you would know it as Cannon Lake, had an outbreak, a COVID outbreak. You know, like last night when I was like talking, or yesterday when I was like talking to Andrea, in that some of their communities, they only have 10 or like under 20 primary language speakers of Secwepemc and Northern Secwepemc language. And elders as well as knowledge keepers were dying. And so it was a huge loss for the community. And then the elders were reaching out to Andrea as a former council member, and was like saying and asking all of these like basic questions around COVID, right? And so she was like, oh, if you just go to the website, and they were like, one, we don't have a computer. Two, is because of the amazing and stellar education that these elders received at one of Canada's Indigenous or Indian residential boarding schools. They had limited to no English. And so if we want to talk about reconciliation, this is reconciliation, this entire framework. So we're like, our guidance, one, is based online, it's all textual. And for folks that have limited to no English reading and writing comprehension, that our guidance is almost completely inaccessible. And then also folks who had mental and or learning disabilities were reaching out to Andrea, of like saying, you work at BCCDC, help me, how do I protect myself? And so she was doing all this like oral translation of our products. And so what we did was we quickly formed an ad hoc knowledge translation working group, and we developed some prevention guidance and prevention documents. The purpose of the working group is to identify priority topics for Indigenous peoples and communities with a focus on COVID-19 prevention as well as vaccination messaging. The working group supports the content development, engagement, as well as the dissemination of our new products. This is this is not the most current membership. I did this PowerPoint a little while ago, and we just finished increasing our size. So it's really important to look at, and I think this is one, it's co-led. Melanie is, she's white, and I'm Cree, and we co-lead the group. And so it is led by Indigenous people. About 60% of the membership is Indigenous. And so it's also an engagement point because we have folks that are living in community. And so it's like that attentiveness of like who's at the table. Also, it's incredibly important to note that we have folks from the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers. And so they're constantly hearing from their membership of what do they need help with message-wise, and that is fed up. So our membership is also another engagement tool. We also have members from the First Nations Health Authority, and have a senior director from the Métis Nation of BC. And so the Indigenous communities and the diversity is also represented within the membership of this working group. So what does our prevention messages look like? So if you'll look here is this was one of our earliest back in January in responding. And literally it only took us 4.5 days. We interviewed a designer on Friday. We worked through the weekend. And on Tuesday, we had this and another piece of another guidance document for prevention messages. You will see that we use illustrations, you know, the width of a car or the dining room table or the span of a female eagle. A wingspan of a female eagle is approximately 2 meters. Wearing a face mask, hand hygiene, as well as like opening the window and keeping like a little bit of fresh air moving through will significantly reduce the chances of someone getting COVID. You will see that it's non-textual based. You tell yourself the pictures. It's done in grayscale. In that, you know, people, we couldn't expect them to have access to a printer. And if they had access to a printer, would they have access to a color printer? This was our next guidance, and that was also done over the weekend, and that's caring for someone who is sick. And again, it's done through illustrations so that our elders who couldn't read could tell themselves the pictures and tell themselves the stories. And so this is what knowledge translation is really about. It's not just about like the message, it is how is the message conveyed, and are there any barriers for the flow of information, and how do we mitigate those barriers? Now, these two first resources were developed by someone who isn't Indigenous. Our next guidance is we actually hired a Shinsham and Haida artist, Shoshona. And it was really funny because we were like, we want to look at caring for someone who's sick at home. And we want it to be like someone's walking into, like Max is walking into grandma's room. And she was like, I got it. And we didn't have to explain what does that, like you can see grandma with her little gray curly hair short under her blanket. We put in a Métis cart. The Métis symbol is in the mask, as well as Coast Salish and some other like plains in Indigenous folks. Cleaning, and so again, is the guidance is black and white, non-textual, although there's text there, but you can kind of tell yourself all of that, tell you and get all the messages from this guidance. Now I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit about our vaccination and our vaccination messages. Again, Max is a reoccurring character, and this was our piece about vaccination, and like what does that process look like? Why are we doing it? And what are some of the possible side effects from the vaccination? And then how long do you have to wait for the actual vaccine to kick in? We significantly departed from our model, and that's because the community was wanting posters or some sort of like conversations to promote vaccine and to address some of the vaccine hesitancy, as well as misinformation that was happening within the survey. So we developed 6 posters. I'll buzz through those, but we also, the community wanted some social media posts. And so we reformatted them for optimal posting for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So this is a print poster, and this is a featuring of Dr. Kate Elliott from the Métis Nation. And the overall series or suite of these posters are calling Protecting Your Community with COVID-19 Immunity. Now, here's the corresponding social media post. We stripped it down, and you can see that it's been co-branded with the Métis Association. This is Dr. Terry Eldred. It's a print poster. Now, I'm not going to show you her social media post. I'll show you Shannon McDowell's social media post. And again, it was co-branded with the First Nations Health Authority. Dr. Kelsey Louie, again, the print poster. And then Nell Wyman, social media post. And the message was around protecting the community through COVID-19 immunity. And like the motivation was, don't get the vaccination for yourself, get it to protect your elders, get it to protect your other community members. And so it was a community-based or community-rooted motivation. And then if you could only print one poster, here's one that has all 6 quotes from all of these amazing Indigenous doctors, which is kind of cool. We ended up printing out our partners, the Friendship Centers and First Nations Health Authority, about 500 sets, and that were distributed throughout BC, through the Friendship Centers, through the band offices, through the health clinics. And so we got really good saturation. So much so, one of the nations, very, very sadly, it was Tk'emlúps the Secwepemc. They said, we really like this Terry Eldred poster. Can we turn it into a billboard? Like, sure. So our designer worked and developed that entire one. So we have 2 billboards on the Secwepemc band, the Tk'emlúps band's land, which is kind of cool. Now we have billboards. And First Nations Health Authority has also taken that Terry Eldred and has featured them within a TV commercial. So there's these posters, there's billboards, and now there's like TV commercials, and it's one cohesive message that, and it's Terry's message of that vaccines are good medicine. We have a duty to protect our elders and our children by getting vaccinated, which is kind of cool, right? Where do I get more information? Here's your QR code you can get, or I can also just send you a little link. Some proposed topics. Again, this is changing, and it's constantly changing because we're constantly trying to reach out to community and say, hey, community, what conversations are happening and what help do you need with communications? And then that goes into the hopper, and then we develop and bang out a resource for the community. So these are just proposed ones right now, but we really go through a really robust informal engagement and community engagement in the development of our guidance documents. We formally say thank you in Cree to a group. Informally, we would just say hi, hi. And the closest expression that we have to goodbye in Cree is examaga, or exi, or exo. That, unlike the finality or goodbye or closing of the doors, like of English, we don't actually have a word that translates into goodbye. Examaga means until then, the A is important. But a closer translation of examaga is now that our paths have crossed, they're forever intertwined, and they will cross again, either in this life or in some other life. So it is with the greatest humility and honor that I raise my hands in gratitude and say, hi, hi, examaga, and I look forward to the next time our paths cross, either virtually or in person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harlan. That was incredible. It was so informative. I have pages of notes here that I'm going to take back to my team. So we're going to open it up now for questions or comments. And so again, please feel free to put your comments directly in the chat box to everyone or raise your hands. Okay, so we already have a question here. So thanks for your talk about the power of language. So 2 questions. Number 1, is the full report of the survey available? And number 2, is there an analogy to make between the use of vulnerable and marginalized?
Sure. I just had this conversation again this morning. Okay, first of all, the report, the survey, we are right now, because we got additional funds and we did a second run of the misinformation survey, right now what we're doing is we had a semi-formal write-up from the data points that we had from April 2020, misinformation 1. We were in the process of getting out a report around that. We use so much of that information already. Then we got a little bump, and so we decided to rerun it. And so right now what we're doing is looking at what are things that we ask the similar sort of questions between 1 and 2, and we're looking at changes. And so we're doing that analysis right now. And so there will be a report for been blessed and just incredibly honored that we get to work with Dr. Tanya Bubla from the Simon Fraser University's the faculty. She's the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences. And so we're working right now on some papers, theoretical combined with frontline experience, because we've been doing like environmental scans, and there are folks who are like firmly rooted within the academy that are like writing these theoretical papers around COVID. And we're like, well, that's not how it happens on the front end, like on the front line, right? So we're doing this mixture of both theoretical and some frontline experience. And so there'll be more that is coming around that. 2 is there an analogy? There is, and it's not. And I had a conversation around this. Vulnerable is a yucky framework. I can actually live with marginalized, because in the inclusion of the ED, that makes it a noun. And so it's drawing attention that if you are working with a marginalized community, that means that there's something being done to them to marginalize them. What is that, that's making them marginalized, right? And how do we then take away bring them from the margins and bring them to the center, or how the center maybe go out to the margins to change so that they're no longer on the margins and they're brought in. So I actually am quite comfortable with the word marginalized because it's something that's being done, it's active. Vulnerable is the positing of me, the problem, and it's not me, the problem, it's the system that's the problem. So I fundamentally do not like that word marginal. I'm sorry, I don't like that word vulnerable. It just drives me creepy.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a few questions. I see Summer's hand up. So Summer, do you want to go ahead?
Hi there. Thank you very much for that great talk. And I just wanted to follow the previous question on the B word and then the M word, which is what we're using right now at our organization when we're talking about improving care experiences for those experiencing marginalization. And we had actually a whole debate on this morning, so this is a very timely talk. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, we're even kind of taking it one step further to ensure that we're not labeling population. What are your thoughts on sort of replacing marginalization on its own, but with sort of terminology that essentially says, you know, we're looking at populations that have experienced structural, institutional, systemic, whatever the word that fits your criteria, marginalization, as sort of a way to ensure that we're not labeling individuals.
Sure, I think you've answered your own question. There's going to be an awkwardness as we try to explore more of this, because we're really, like, reconciliation asks us to reflect. Like, that's the beauty part of reconciliation. It's personal reflection that then comes out within better relations with Indigenous people. And so, and as a result of that, I think that we must be kind with us. This is a process. This is an ever evolving process. So I was like working with Surrey. Surrey was like issuing this big report on homelessness. And they're like, what do we call them? Like, it should be, are we labeling them? Exactly your question of like, should we call them marginalized or marginalization and all this other stuff, right? And they said, let's be kind. And as we work this through and as we figure it out and we develop this new way of thinking and this new way of communicating, and we draw this attentiveness to power, that there has to be a transitional period and be kind to ourselves. So exactly what you just did in defining it, we are going to use marginalization, or people who have been historically marginalized. This is why we're choosing this. This is our intent. And until there is a better and a more honoring way that we can have this conversation, and maybe the language evolves, that we can have like a destigmatizing person first language, this is what we're going to do. So define it and just say, it is not our intent. We want to enter into good relations. And so just, you know, exactly how land acknowledgement, what does it mean? Just at the beginning, it takes like a little paragraph. This is what we're using. This is why we're using. And until we can find a better language, it is not our intent to do harm. And so it's just this, and I think what you're drawing in attentiveness is like, we're thinking about this. And until we can learn more and we can be better, this is what we're going to do, is that transitional thing of defining what language. Really, it is calling you in, and we don't mean to have negative, unintended consequences by not reflecting upon the language that we're using. And I also like, don't make it a terms of reference. Don't do it like really call the people in of like saying, this is what we're using, and this is why we're using, and we don't mean to do harm. And I think that would signal to the community of like, oh, these people want to enter into a relationship, rather than calling me vulnerable and other, and that I need savior and that I need help. Because that's what I'm hearing with my heart and with my ear of what you're saying. So just, I think, define, and I think you've already answered your own question.
Great, thank you, Harlan, and thank you, Summer. So we probably have time for one more question. So there's a question from Sharon in the chat. Terrific talk and resources. Thanks so much. Can you speak to whether you found a difference in stigma data over time around variants of concern as they've been developing?
Yes. Well, one, we're digging into that right now, so I can only share with you some preliminary we're really interested in looking at that slide of like experiencing stigma and stigmatizing behaviors. The numbers didn't go down. In some communities, it actually went up. And so we're trying to like figure out what's going on there. And so we're just kind of digging into that and just querying the data a little bit more. So that was the misinformation survey. For the actual update of the language guide, we actually, variants of concern, as well as variant Alpha through Delta, that was all new. Like they were assigning it to countries, which was like rather stigmatizing. So we're quite happy that they went to this, like using the Greek alphabet of like Alpha through Delta. And so what we have to do is we're going to build that out within the system of looking at variants of concern, the nomenclature of like why we shouldn't be saying the Indian variant or the UK variant, and what does that carry and or connote. So these are all things that we have to grapple with in the update. And so for the working group, which is a representative of some amazing folks within BCCDC, and we also have some a ministerial representative to help us with the update. And so there will be, we're quickly trying to get that out as soon as possible. But again, like when we release this in June, variants of concern, I don't like, if it was on the radar, it was like way far, like no one was talking about it. And so we have to address those. Again, language changes and evolves, but we just be really attentiveness of like, what are we connoting and what are we like saying and challenging that power, and that language is power.
Great, thank you so much. So we only have a couple minutes. So I'm going to try to sneak in one more question, just a very pragmatic question. So thanks for sharing the working group, and it's just so fantastic to see how the priority topics are identified and really accessible resources are made. I'm wondering if you have any tips or recommendations on how you respond to the rate of information you need to get out with changing guidance and changing questions, and how you engage that working group on that rapid basis to get the resources turned around so quickly.
We meet weekly. We can have like 3 or 4 projects going on at the same time. Like we may have one in like, what do we want to focus in on? What's coming down the pipeline? We finalize a product and then we already have one. So we have like 4 projects. And it's all done without an agenda, because we take an Indigenous way of approach to the work. It's collaborative, it's iterative. Also, we've had instances where we released a guidance and the community was like, this doesn't sit well with me. And what we do is immediately do an update. And so we don't let our perfection inhibit or slow us down. I know that's for so many people, like they strive for perfection, but it may take like 3 years to get something done for it to be perfect. So when we send out our documents, we're like, please, like we want to hear your feedback and your guidance. And so the actual product itself may be an engagement and touch point too. And so we've had to do like little changes, because we have these amazing knowledge synthesizers for prevention and for vaccine that is vetting through all of the current literature as well as the guidelines. And so our guidance is in line and within the spirit of current lit as well as within the current guidelines. So we are worried and we are concerned. We try our best with the best intention to have the strongest, cleanest, but we're going to miss things because it's community, and so what we do is we do not let our perfection inhibit our work. Gained a lot. I would like to get a copy of the slides if possible. I will send it to Megan and Tina, a PDF, and you're more than happy to R&D, rob and duplicate. Come up with your own that speaks to your own community and commonly used languages and frames. Like I encourage you, like ours is not the end all or be all. But just come up, you can use it, like literally R&D it, rob and duplicate. For sure, send slides as a follow-up, everyone. Thank you so much, Samara. I'm so honored with the time. You know, time is, within a Western framework, is one of our most valuable gifts. And so I just want to thank you all for the last 60 minutes and that I take it as a gift. And I am so honored and so blessed to spend the space, place, and time with you all and just sharing you a little bit of work. I'll see you on November 12th, okay? It'll be a date. That talk around research builds upon this, but takes it to a whole new level of challenging knowledge production. And it's really around decolonizing these practices. So just thank you so much.